where we left off, we went through all of the literature, the genres, the type of literature that is in the New Testament last week. And I'm going to start this week by talking about the relationship of the four Gospels to one another. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about Jesus' life from sources outside of the Bible, from other authors who mention him. And then hopefully we can get started also maybe on the infancy narratives, the stories of Jesus' birth, which are in only the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Mark begins his gospel with John the Baptist. He's not interested in the story of Jesus' birth. And John begins his gospel with a prologue or a theological reflection on who Jesus is. You might remember the words, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's the beginning of John's gospel. Okay, so last week I pointed out that Mark was the first gospel that was written, and the reason we know that is because Matthew and Luke, when you put the three of them together, which we call a synopsis, when you put the texts of those three gospels side by side, it becomes clear that Matthew and Luke used Mark when they wrote as a source, one of their sources. In fact, at the beginning of Luke's gospel, he mentions that he's writing his account based on a variety of sources. So he doesn't say what those sources were, but it's obvious that Mark was one of them because in some cases they even use Mark word for word. The theory is, and we need to take some of this with a grain of salt, because the fact of the matter is that there's looked at from an historical point of view, okay, from the point of view of how modern historians verify what we know and what we don't know, rather than looked at from the point of view of a theologian who might say that the four Gospels are inspired by the Holy Spirit. That's a theological judgment. That's not an historical judgment. So what I'm going to do is look at what we know from an historical point of view. It seems pretty clear from authors in the 2nd century, in the year between 100 and 200 AD, that Mark was probably written in the city of Rome somewhere between 65 and 70 AD. Okay, so that's an important date because that helps us date the Gospels that used Mark. Mark, you might remember, we were told by a 2nd century bishop, was the assistant of Peter. And so Peter is the source of Mark's information. And Peter was martyred in Rome under the Emperor Nero sometime in the mid-60s AD. So Mark was written somewhere right in there. And Mark's basic outline is also followed by Matthew and Luke, with the exception of the fact that Mark does not have an infancy narrative. Okay, so if you look then at Matthew and Luke next to Mark, you will also discover that there is a lot of material related to what Jesus taught that Matthew and Luke have in common, but that is not in Mark. Okay, so a lot of the parables, even the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is in Matthew and Luke, but it's not in Mark. So most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke also used a source that they call a sayings source, which is designated by the letter Q, which is the first letter in the German word for source, because these were German scholars who came up with these theories, Lutheran scholars, by the way. And so they call the saying source Q. So if you look at Matthew and Luke, you put in the passages that they have from Mark. About 60% of Matthew and Luke comes from Mark, and another at least 30% of Matthew and Luke, they have in common are these teachings of Jesus, parables, and the Sermon on the Mount is both in Matthew and in Luke, although they put it in different places. So that adds up to about 90% of Matthew and Luke, right? But then Matthew and Luke also have material that is unique to their Gospels. So, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, we have two of my favorite parables, the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan. Those two appear only in Luke. And in Matthew, over the past several Sundays, the text has been parables that appear only in Matthew. For example, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. This coming Sunday, the text is the parable of the judgment of the nations, where Jesus says the Son of Man will come at the end of time. All the nations will be gathered and he will separate the sheep from the goats. I'm sure you remember this parable. And the criteria for determining sheep from goats is whether or not you fed the hungry, you gave the thirsty drink, you visited those in prison, you clothed the naked. In other words, you took care of people, and especially the very needy and poverty-stricken in the community. Okay, so Matthew and Luke, then, we can say, is composed of, each of them is composed of three sources. Mark, the saying source, which is Q, and then material that is unique to each of those two Gospels. Where, for example, Luke may have derived the parable of the prodigal son, which is a literary masterpiece. When you read it in the original Greek, Luke's writing is just impeccable. I mean, he's the Shakespeare of the Bible. So where he may have derived that or learned about that, we don't know. But there are a number of ways that we can surmise where Matthew and Luke may have written their Gospels. Okay, if you look at the way in which they arrange the story of Jesus. So, for example, in Matthew, the way Matthew arranges the story of Jesus is that he makes him, he uses the outline of the story of Moses to tell the story of Jesus. So, for example, in the beginning of Matthew, there's the story of the killing of the babies, Herod killing all the babies in Bethlehem. Well, that mirrors the story of Moses, who, remember, was saved out of the River Nile because the Egyptians were killing all of the Hebrew babies at the time Moses was born. And then as his first, one of his first Acts, Matthew has Jesus climb a mountain and there give the Sermon on the Mount, which is largely an interpretation of the law of Moses. So just as Moses ascended the mountain on Sinai to receive the law from God, Matthew has Jesus ascend a mountain and interpret the laws for the people and especially for his disciples. So it's pretty clear. And in addition to that, Matthew's gospel also cites the prophets over and over again. Okay, so Matthew will tell a story and then he will say, this was to fulfill what the prophet said, and then he'll tell you what the verse was. So it's pretty obvious that Matthew was written in the context of a largely Jewish community. Otherwise, how would these people be able to understand what Matthew was saying? A Gentile audience wouldn't know anything about Moses. They wouldn't know anything about the story of the Ten Commandments and receiving them on Mount Sinai. They wouldn't know anything about the prophets and what they said. So it's probable that Matthew wrote his gospel in a community that consisted, at least in large part, of Jewish Christians. That's my personal opinion. Some scholars disagree with me, but that's my personal opinion. I think Matthew was written somewhere in Galilee, which is the area of Palestine where Jesus was born and where most of his ministry took place. At one of the earliest churches that existed, one of the earliest Christian churches that existed in Galilee. In around the year 75, somewhere between 75 and 80 AD, Matthew composed his gospel. And I personally think that it was written in Galilee. Okay, now Luke arranges the material he takes from Mark and from Q differently than Matthew does. Luke is not retelling the story of Jesus in a way that mirrors the story of Moses. So Luke contains a lot of material that would have been more familiar to Gentiles. For example, Luke dates some of what happens according to Roman history. Okay, so for example, remember the story of Jesus' birth. Luke talks about the emperor, Caesar Augustus, taking a census, and that therefore Joseph and Mary had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Okay, so there's a citation there. He dates based on Roman history. And then when he talks about John the Baptist, he says on the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Okay, Tiberius was Caesar Augustus's nephew, I believe it was. He was a distant relative, and he succeeded Caesar Augustus as the second emperor of Rome. And so Luke dates John the Baptist according to Tiberius Caesar's reign. So Luke was probably written for a Gentile Christian community. We don't know where, but we do know that there were Gentile Christian communities in both Asia Minor, which is current-day Turkey, and in Greece. So both Asia Minor and Greece are the places where Paul was very active establishing churches. Corinth, Thessaloniki, and other Philippi. And we know that on Paul's first missionary journey, he established several churches in Asia Minor. So Luke probably comes from one of those. One little interesting tidbit about Luke: Luke also wrote the book of Acts, which I think I mentioned last week. And I think it's in chapter 16, Luke is narrating the story of the apostles and the spread of the Christian church throughout the Roman Empire. And in chapter 16, Luke switches pronouns from they went here and they went there to we went here and we went there. So it appears as if Luke is saying he was a part of Paul's entourage at one point. And most people believed at the time the Bible was formed that Luke's bona fides, so to speak, the reason his gospel was authoritative was because he was an associate of Paul the apostle. And I should back up real quick and say that Matthew was accepted into the New Testament because most people at the time believed that Matthew was composed by the disciple Matthew, who was also known as Levi, the tax collector, at the time that Jesus called Matthew into his circle of disciples. So that's why Matthew was accepted also as an authoritative source for our information on the life, ministry, and death and resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so what's left then is the Gospel of John, right? So John is entirely different from the three synoptic gospels. He tells us a story. It's so completely different that there's not even any point in putting John's text next to the other three, because the story there's almost nothing in common. The only thing in John that is also in Mark, Matthew, and Luke is the feeding of the 5,000 story. Okay, that's in all four gospels, but that's about it. John has Jesus, for example, cleansing the temple, the story of Jesus going on the Temple Mount and overturning the tables of the money changers, driving the people who are selling sacrificial animals out. John has that story at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke have that story during the last week of Jesus' life. So those are the kind of differences we're talking about. They're vast differences. The other thing is that John has Jesus in Jerusalem something like 6 times. Okay, he has Jesus in Jerusalem for three separate Passover celebrations, which means that if you followed the outline of John's gospel, you would have to say that Jesus' ministry lasted at least 3 years, because you have 3 separate Passover celebrations. Whereas Mark, Matthew, and Luke, if you follow their chronology, it appears that Jesus' ministry lasted something like 18 to 24 months, not any more than that, certainly. So, and the other thing that I want to mention about John that is so different from the other Gospels is that when John tells stories about Jesus, he tells them in great detail. There is much more dialogue in John's Gospel. When Jesus, in John's Gospel, for example, when he turns water into wine, okay, that particular story is only in John. He has Jesus talking to his mother Mary. Mary comes to Jesus and says, "They're running out of wine." And Jesus says, what does that have to do with me? Or something to that effect. And then, of course, we know what happens. He he instructs the steward of the wedding to fill the jugs, which are used for purification, Jewish purification rituals, fill them with water, and then they're turned into wine, and it's the finest wine at the wedding. So John has different miracle stories, and there's much more dialogue. Probably the most famous one in the Gospel of John is the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. That's in John only. And that occurs in John's Gospel at the end of Jesus' life, toward the last week of his life, because that is the event, according to John, that triggers the conspiracy to arrest Jesus and have him executed. Because once he raises Lazarus from the dead, the authorities are afraid that everyone's going to proclaim Jesus the Messiah, and they're going to have political problems with Rome. So they want to get rid of him as quickly as they can. In any case, you might remember that Jesus is told by emissaries of Lazarus, and you also might remember that Lazarus has two sisters, Mary and Martha. And by the way, I should mention that Luke also has a story about Mary in his gospel. So there is that parallel anyway. But there's a long dialogue between Jesus, Mary, and Martha before Jesus actually raises Lazarus from the dead. So that's typical of John. Now, when was John written, and how do we know that? Well, we do know that when the Jewish war, the Roman war, broke out, okay, and this was the first. There were two Jewish rebellions against Rome. The first one was in 66 AD, and the war lasted for 4 long years. It ended only in 70. Okay, we do know that John left Jerusalem when the war broke out, and that he had a community of his own. And second century sources claim that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a member of John's community. And what John did is he picked up and he left Jerusalem when the war broke out, and he resettled in Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor. And there he established a Christian community under his authority. And it was much later. John is the only one of the apostles, as I mentioned last week, who was not martyred. He was very young when he became a disciple, and he lived to a ripe old age. So he lived much longer than any of the other disciples did. And most people think then that John was, the Gospel of John consists of stories, recollections from John himself, and they were probably compiled only after John died, but they were compiled and put together into what we now know as John's Gospel in Ephesus around the year 90 AD. So that was the latest of the Gospels that were composed. Okay, so that is the relationship between the four Gospels and how it is, where they came from, and approximately when they were composed. So I'm going to get into how historians try to reconstruct the life of Jesus momentarily. But first, I want to mention a couple of authors who refer to Jesus outside of the Bible. Okay, now the most important one is a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. Josephus was actually one of the leaders of the rebellion that led to the Roman War between 66 and 70 AD. He came from Galilee, the same area where Jesus was from, and he was captured. This was captured by Vespasian, who was the Roman general, and he said to Vespasian when he was captured, he says, I prophesy that you're going to be the next emperor of Rome. So he actually took Josephus into his protection. He sent him to Rome, and Josephus lived out his life there in Rome. And in fact, Vespasian did become a Roman emperor in the middle of that Jewish war. He became the next Roman emperor. And Josephus wrote 3 books while he was in Rome. One was called The Antiquities of the Jews, which is a history of the Jews. Another one was a history of the Jewish war. And another one was an autobiography. So the book where he has a reference to Jesus is his book called The Antiquities of the Jews. In that book, there is a paragraph about Jesus. Josephus says, at this time, meaning around the time of the appearance of John the Baptist, which was, if Luke's dating is correct, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, that would put it about in the year 28 AD. Okay, that's an important date. Remember that date because that's the beginning of Jesus' ministry, 28 AD. So Josephus says Jesus appeared, and he was a man who loved the truth and who taught. I'm not quoting this directly now. I don't have the text in front of me, but he talks about how Jesus taught and that he was a doer of startling deeds. And by that, what Josephus means by that is the miracles of Jesus. Okay, so Josephus is important for a number of reasons. Number one, everything he says confirms what the Gospels say. So Josephus confirms when Jesus begins his ministry. He confirms that he was a teacher. He confirms that he was a miracle worker. And he confirms that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. So that's a very, very important source. That doesn't sound like a lot of information, but it's the essential and most important information we could have about Jesus. And that comes from an author who is not writing for the Christian Bible. The only other one I want to refer to is a Roman author by the name of Suetonius. He makes mention of the Christian church in Rome. He mentions that there are followers of Chrestus. He didn't get it quite right. But he confirms, Suetonius confirms, that under the Emperor Nero, the Christian church in Rome underwent serious and severe persecution. Some of it is almost hard to talk about. It was so bad. So anyway, we don't have information so much about Jesus from Suetonius, but we do have information about his first and earliest followers in Rome. And this was, like I said earlier, in the mid-60s AD. Okay, so let's back up. So the sources we have for the life of Jesus are primarily the four New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of which tell the story a little differently because they are presenting Jesus for an audience, and they want their audience, as they learn about Jesus, they want their audience, they want to nourish the faith of their audience. The reason for writing the Gospels wasn't so much to convey information as it was to encourage people to come to faith. So these are evangelical documents. They're not historical documents as much as they are evangelical documents. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are preaching. They're not writing history. So the fact that they tell the story differently, while that can confuse an historian, it actually makes our theological understanding of Jesus much more rich because we see him from different points of view. For example, in Matthew, we see his essential Jewishness, the fact that he was born and raised a Jew in first century Galilee, and that he was very much a part of the Jewish community and an observant Jew, very much an observant Jew. In Mark emphasizes the story of Jesus' passion, his suffering, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. And Luke emphasizes Jesus' care and concern for marginalized people. In Luke, Jesus is constantly caring for the poor, the sick, those who are left out. Luke has Jesus associating with women far more than any of the other gospel writers. In fact, Luke tells us that Mary Magdalene and two other women joined Jesus and his disciples and saw to their needs. And Luke has the story of the woman who bursts into the party that Simon the Pharisee had for Jesus and who cried at his feet and wiped his feet with her hair. Obviously, Jesus had ministered to her and she was so grateful that she wept at his feet. So Luke has all of those kinds of stories. And so we can see in Luke Jesus' care for the poor and the marginalized. Okay. And in John, what's emphasized most of all is the spirituality of Jesus, his deep prayer life, his relationship to his Father, and his spiritual teachings. So the fact that each gospel presents Jesus a little differently gives us a far more richer picture of who he was. So I just want to throw that out there as being very, very important. And the fact that they tell the story a little differently shouldn't trouble anyone in terms of its truth value, because what these writers are interested in is less what happened exactly when and in what order. What their concern is presenting a picture of Jesus that gives us a richer understanding of who he was. So, back to history then. Reconstructing Jesus' life. This becomes a matter of trying to put together the various pieces of a very complicated puzzle. Okay, so the only thing we can do is we can look at the four Gospels, we can look at the stories, and try to reconstruct Jesus' life in a way that makes sense. Okay, so what makes sense as the stories that are early in Jesus' life? What makes sense as the stories that are later in Jesus' life? What makes sense as the stories of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, and so forth? So I've done a lot of thinking about this, and I've got my own theories. So I will present those to you. But you have to keep in mind that these are only theories. I wasn't there, okay? So I didn't see any of this happen. So I can give you what I think is a reasonable reconstruction of Jesus' life. But like I say, it's all based on speculation. Okay, so let's start with Jesus' birth. Matthew and Luke both have what we call infancy narratives. All right, but they differ. Okay. Matthew tells the story from the point of view of Joseph. Luke tells the story from the point of view of Mary. So let's look at the details of Matthew first. According to Matthew, Joseph already lives in Bethlehem. He doesn't have to have, Matthew has nothing about a Roman census that causes Joseph to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. According to Matthew, when the three wise men come to give their gifts to the baby Jesus, they come to a house, not to a stable. Okay, so they have Joseph and Mary. Matthew has Joseph and Mary living in a house in Bethlehem. Okay, so that's the first thing. The other thing is that the narrative follows Joseph throughout. So Matthew tells the story of how Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant before they were married. He was going to divorce her, but then Joseph had a dream, and God told him in the dream not to worry about the child that was Mary was pregnant with, because it was a child conceived by the Holy Spirit. So Joseph goes ahead with the marriage. And then in Matthew, we have the story of the three wise men. That's not in Luke, it's in Matthew. Okay, the three wise men from the east, they're probably astrologers who came from somewhere up in the Arabian settlements. Could have been Babylonia, could have been Persia for that matter. But in any case, they were astrologers who were following a star. Okay, astrologers believed that the stars could tell us a lot about what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. And they predicted events based on stars, so that when they saw this bright star shining, they took that to mean that a new king of the Jews had been born. So they follow where that star is shining, and that star takes them to Judea. Now, the first thing they do is they ask Herod where the king of the Jews is supposed to be born. And Herod, who was a tyrant and a very cruel one at that, gets nervous. Okay, he thinks, oh my goodness, if a king of the Jews was born, that means I'm going to lose my position as the king of the Jews. So he tells the wise men to go to Bethlehem, where the Messiah was supposed to be born according to prophecy, and then to let him know how to find Jesus. So Herod says, let me know so I can pay him homage too. Well, Herod's plan is to kill him because he's a threat to his power. But the wise men, according to Matthew, are warned not to return to Herod in a dream, So they don't. They leave after they present their gifts to the baby Jesus, and they go back home. And then Herod finds out that the wise men left. He gets so angry that he has all the children from, I believe, age 2 or 3 and down murdered in and around Bethlehem, so that he can be sure that he kills this so-called king of the Jews that was just born. Okay, well, Matthew tells us that Joseph was warned that Herod was going to do this, so he is told in a dream to take Mary and the baby Jesus and to go to Egypt. All right, so off they go to Egypt, and there they stay until Herod is dead. Now, this is important in terms of dating Jesus' birth, because we know that Herod died in the year 4 BC. So the probable year of Jesus' birth is 4 BC. Some people suggest, well, maybe it was earlier, 5 or 6. I think it was the same year that Herod died, because as Matthew tells the story, Herod dies shortly after he tries to go after the baby Jesus, and he kills all those infants in and around Bethlehem. So that's why that date is important. Now, after Herod dies, according to Matthew, Joseph and Mary come back to Palestine, and they find out that Herod's son Archelaus is ruling in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. So they're afraid of Archelaus. So what they do is they travel up the Jordan River Valley, which is to the east of where Archelaus is ruling, and they settle in Galilee, up to the north, in a little village called Nazareth. So that's Matthew's story about Jesus' birth. Okay. Now let's go to Luke. According to Luke, and by the way, when Luke narrates the story of Jesus' birth, he also narrates the story of John the Baptist's birth as well. According to Luke, Jesus and John were cousins. Okay, so he narrates the two stories together, but I'm just going to focus on what he says about Jesus, not about John the Baptist. According to Luke, the first event is that the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and tells her that she has been favored by God, that she is going to bear a son, and he is going to save his people, and she needs him to name, she needs to name the baby Jesus. Okay, Jesus, it was a common name, and if you analyze the name in Hebrew, it means Yahweh saves. Yahweh is the Old Testament name for God. So the name Jesus means God saves. Okay, so Mary is told to name her baby Jesus. And then the next major event is that Caesar Augustus, okay, he's the emperor, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Okay, so the Roman Empire stretches now all the way from the British Isles, all the way through Spain, France, parts of what became Germany, although much of Germany is still under the rule of people that they referred to as barbarians. And it includes the Middle East, all of what is now Turkey, Palestine, Syria, and all of North Africa. This is a huge chunk of land. The entire Mediterranean Sea is owned by Rome. Okay, so the Romans have done something nobody else has ever been able to do up to that point. They built a system of roads between all their major cities, so that economic trade could take place between all of these big cities. And they also had the Mediterranean Sea so that they could use shipping, to ship, for example. The Romans needed grain that was grown in Egypt. So large ships full of grain would carry the wheat from Egypt up to Rome. In any case, this is a big place. Caesar Augustus is the first emperor to rule Rome. According to Luke, he calls for a census, okay? And Luke dates the census. He says when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay, so we're going to run into some problems here. Quirinius was not the governor of Syria until the year 6 AD. All right, now Jesus is already 10 years old in the year 6 AD. So he was not born when Quirinius was governor of Syria. But what Luke is doing, you see, what the genius of this story is that Luke is presenting Caesar Augustus as this guy who's so powerful that he can do a census on all these people throughout the Roman Empire. All he does is snap his finger and all the people are counted. That sounds like a very powerful man, right? And it's also the case that Caesar was known as, for example, he was called the Prince of Peace because he brought peace to the Roman Empire. He was also called Son of God. All right, so what Luke is doing here is he's presenting Caesar Augustus as a powerful man, but in the end, Caesar's decree, what it really results in is Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem so that the Messiah can be born in the city that he was supposed to come from, namely the city of David. So Luke's narrative is what he's communicating here in this story of Jesus' birth. What he's communicating is that Caesar seems to be the most powerful person on earth, the Son of God, the Prince of Peace, and so forth. But in reality, the Prince of Peace is not Caesar, it's Jesus. And everything that Caesar does ultimately is serving God's purpose in sending Jesus as the real Prince of Peace, the real Son of God, and the real Savior of the human race. Okay, so Luke's story is completely different because Luke wants to convey a different message than Matthew does. In Matthew, the birth of Jesus mirrors the birth of Moses. Mary and Joseph come out of Egypt, just as Moses did. Jesus was saved from a massacre of infants, just as Moses was. Okay, so Matthew tells the story in that way. Luke is wanting to communicate something entirely different. What he wants to say is that the true Savior of the world is born at a time when Caesar is hailed as the Savior of the world, but in fact is not. Okay, so because everything Caesar does serves God's purpose. Okay, so according to Luke, Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem where Jesus is born because of this census that Augustus was taking. Now I'm going to end by just pointing to one last tidbit of history here that's interesting. Okay. Luke gets the year of the census wrong, but the fact that a census was taken is not wrong. A census was taken in the year 6 AD. All right. And the reason that Augustus took that census was because Rome taxed its provinces according to the value of the produce of that province. So, in order to calculate the value of the produce that Galilee would produce, okay, Galilee was a farming region, and they produced grapes and olives and wheat and vegetables and other fruits. It's a very fertile area. What Caesar was interested in is figuring out the value of that produce so he could set the taxes that he wanted to collect. So he did this in the year 6 AD. Jesus was approximately 10 years old at the time and was probably working with his father, Joseph. The ruler of Galilee at that time was one of Herod the Great's sons. Remember, Herod died in 4 BC, the year Jesus was born. His son, Herod Antipas, was ruling Galilee, and he was building a city called Sepphoris, which is about 7 miles from Nazareth. Now, it's probable that if in fact Joseph was the carpenter that the Gospels say he was, that he was probably working on that city, and that Jesus probably would have been with him while he worked. So that's where we're at for now. So if you just remember the year of Jesus' birth, 4 BC, and we're not going to have any information about him aside from an incident Luke records. When he's about 12 years old, they go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and he's found in the temple. You might remember that story. But the next major event in Jesus' life is when he comes to John the Baptist. And remember, we dated that at the year 28. Okay, so next week we'll pick it up, Jesus' ministry in Galilee, starting in the year 28 AD.